Let us begin. Perhaps you are here because you seek a framework, a way to navigate a world that seems increasingly complex and irrational. Perhaps you carry the lessons of a mentor who is no longer with you, someone who taught you to look beyond the consensus. Or perhaps you recall a parent who survived the great upheavals of the 20th century, a person who possessed a kind of pragmatic wisdom you are only now beginning to fully appreciate. This conversation will be deeply personal. I am going to tell you about a mental model my father, Tivadar, instilled in me when I was a boy in Budapest during the Nazi occupation of 1944. For decades, I built upon it with complex theories, dismissing the original lesson as a simple heuristic for survival in a brutal time. I only rediscovered its profound power during the darkest hours of a global crisis in my adult life. This principle has since become the true foundation for every major market analysis and every philanthropic strategy I have conceived. Most people know me for my financial theories or for wagering vast sums on currency markets. But what they don't know is that behind every major trade, every decision to challenge an authoritarian regime, there has been a simple set of principles taught to me by a man who was not a financier, but a survivor. A man who understood something fundamental about how human systems work, and more importantly, how they fail. Today, I want to share this model with you, not because I believe everyone should think the same way, but because the thinking embedded within it may be precisely what our modern, consensus-driven world needs. By the end of this conversation, you might understand why the most robust truths are forged in adversity, why a survivor's wisdom can guide modern financial and political decisions, and why the voice of a parent who taught you how to think, not what to think, may be the most important guide you will ever have. I was a boy living under an assumed identity in Budapest. The year was 1944. My father, Tivadar, was a man who had survived the First World War and had seen empires collapse. He was not a man marked by hardship, but by a sharp, unsentimental clarity. He had a routine not of prayer, but of critical inquiry. Every day was an exercise in observing the gap between official pronouncements and the reality on the streets. His conversations were not with a higher power, but with the flawed logic of the systems around us. I was a curious child, and I asked him how he knew what to do, how he always seemed to be one step ahead. "I am not ahead," he told me, with an authority that dwarfed any I would later encounter on Wall Street. "I am simply looking at the same facts as everyone else, but I am asking different questions. I am asking, where is the flaw in the official story?" That night, he didn't teach me a prayer. He taught me a method. He told me, first understand the prevailing belief. Understand what everyone takes for granted. Then find the internal contradiction, the fallacy in that belief. Finally, have the courage to act on your discovery, even if you are entirely alone. 3 simple steps. It took me 30 years in the world's most complex financial markets to grasp their true meaning. As a boy, I thought it was just a set of rules for not getting captured. I had no idea this principle contained everything I would need to navigate the greatest booms and busts of our time. For years after the war, I didn't think much about my father's method. I was busy studying in London, then making my way in New York, convinced that sophisticated analysis and intellectual rigor were all one needed to succeed. I went to the London School of Economics, then to Wall Street. I started my own fund. I made billions. I achieved a level of success that exceeded all conventional measures. But there was always a sense of disquiet, a search for a coherent philosophy that went deeper than market cycles or arbitrage opportunities. I remember the night I fully grasped the power of my father's principle. It was the autumn of 2008. Lehman Brothers had collapsed, and the global financial system, a system I knew intimately, was in a state of cardiac arrest. I had not personally failed. My fund was secure, but the entire intellectual framework of the Western world, the belief in efficient markets and rational actors, was disintegrating. I was in my library late one night surrounded by charts and reports and all pointing to a systemic meltdown, a failure of imagination on a global scale. It was then that I heard my father's voice, as clear as if he were sitting across from me. Not in a whisper, but with his characteristic pragmatism. Find the flaw in the official story. The memory came flooding back, not of a peaceful house, but of the tense quiet of hiding in Budapest, not of a prayer, but of a cold, rational method for survival. I found myself articulating the words I had lived by, but had never fully honored as the source of my success. First, understand the prevailing belief. Then, find the internal contradiction. Something shifted in that moment. The circumstances of the world were still catastrophic. But my perspective was sharpened. Instead of seeing only a financial crisis to be navigated, I saw the catastrophic failure of a flawed ideology. This wasn't just about preserving capital. It was about demonstrating that the prevailing belief in perfectly rational markets was a dangerous fantasy. It was a real-world vindication of my theory of reflexivity, the idea that our biases don't just interpret reality, but create it. Have the courage to act on your discovery, even if you are entirely alone. That line struck me with force. For my entire career, I had been making bets against the consensus, trying to act before the stampede. But my father's principle wasn't about predicting the future. It was about understanding the present fallacy and acting on it, step by step, even when the final outcome was unknowable. The next day, instead of just managing my own positions, I began to think about the system's next logical step. The challenge wasn't saving a company, but thinking about what would be required to save the concept of an open, global society from the fallout. This led to the third and hardest part of his principle, the implicit need to accept that your own hypothesis is fallible. I had always believed success came from imposing a superior analysis upon the market, but my father's method demanded something more profound: to hold my own conclusions lightly, to constantly search for the flaw in my own thinking, and to remain open to the reality the market presented, even if it contradicted my thesis. In the months that followed, the market stabilized, not because I had figured everything out, but because I had recommitted to a process that combined intense, contrarian analysis with a genuine surrender to reality as the ultimate arbiter. That mental model became my daily practice. When people ask how I decide where to invest or which political causes to support through my foundations, they expect me to talk about macroeconomic analysis or geopolitical strategy. But the truth is, I start with my father's method. First, understand the prevailing belief. This isn't about mysticism. It's about rigorously stripping away my own biases to perceive what is actually needed for an open society to function, not just what would be a profitable trade. When I look at rising authoritarianism, I see the need to support a free press. When I see a captured judiciary, I see the need to fund the rule of law. These are not merely philanthropic opportunities. They are interventions at the site of a systemic flaw. When I look at the long-term health of civilization, I see the need for the pillars of an open society: the rule of law, a free press, and the protection of minorities. When I look at the risks of dogmatic ideologies, I see the need for critical thinking and robust public debate. These aren't investment opportunities I calculated. They are the structural needs I perceived when I learned to see beyond my own immediate financial interests. This leads to the next stage of my father's method: committing to the core problem. This taught me to align my efforts with what strengthens open society rather than what serves my ego. I've learned to love the intractable problems of political and social reform, not just the market inefficiencies I can easily exploit. I've learned to love the challenges that push the boundaries of what a philanthropic foundation can achieve, not just the challenges that guarantee a measurable return. When you are committed to the struggle for an open society, work stops feeling like work. The constant pressure, the public demonization, all of it becomes secondary to the intellectual and moral imperative of the task. And this leads to the final part of his principle: acting with wisdom rather than ambition. Not every good idea is yours to pursue. Not every societal flaw is yours to fix. The method helps me distinguish between what I am capable of doing and what I am uniquely positioned to do. I could have continued to exclusively manage my fund and become even wealthier. I could have retired to a life of quiet comfort. But when I applied my father's principles honestly, using my capital to challenge closed systems was the action I felt compelled to pursue, even when those systems seemed monolithic and unbreakable. Have the courage to act on your discovery, even if you are entirely alone. This is perhaps the most practical element of the entire model. Every significant social or political change requires you to act before the outcome is certain. You have to fund the independent newspaper before you know if democracy will take root. You have to short the currency before the central bank admits its policy is unsustainable. The principle doesn't ask for certainty. It asks for the intellectual courage to take the next logical step based on your analysis. And this rests on the foundation of it all, trusting the process of fallibility. This is not about being passive or fatalistic. It is about recognizing that your own perspective, your own hypothesis, is inherently limited and likely flawed. You must allow reality to be the ultimate arbiter. I once believed a certain economic policy would stabilize a nation. My plan involved a quick, decisive intervention. Reality's plan involved years of struggle that revealed deeper institutional problems we never could have understood otherwise. The results were more robust and sustainable than anything I could have planned, but they required me to trust the process of trial and error, even when it proved my initial thesis wrong. I've watched this model work in areas far beyond markets. When a philanthropic strategy was failing, when I was locked in a political battle, when I felt disconnected from my core mission, the principle always brought me back to center. What is the prevailing belief in this conflict? What is its internal contradiction? Often I would see my own contributions to a stalemate I had been blaming on others. I would see opportunities for a new strategy hidden inside an apparent failure. This allowed me to act based on what would actually be effective and move the situation forward, not what my ego demanded or my frustration dictated. The courage required is often intellectual, the courage to abandon a cherished belief, to be bigger than your current analytical framework. And you must trust this process because intellectual and social progress do not follow a predictable timeline. Trust is only meaningful when the outcome is uncertain. Perhaps the most difficult discipline is accepting that reality's feedback loop is a better guide than your own brilliant plan. It releases you from the burden of being infallible and allows you to focus on the process of learning and adapting. Of course, here is the final part of the narrative, adapted for the George Soros persona. Routine. It requires intellectual courage, because the right action is often the contrarian one, the choice that pits you against the entire weight of conventional wisdom. It is the response that requires you to be bigger than your own intellectual ego. You must act even when you cannot see the full path, because market dislocations don't announce themselves in advance and societal change doesn't follow a predictable pattern. Trust in your analysis is only meaningful when the outcome is uncertain. This requires you to trust the process of inquiry more than your own plan. This is perhaps the most difficult principle in the context of high-stakes finance and political conflict, but it is also the most liberating. It releases you from the burden of needing to be a prophet and allows you to focus on being a rigorous analyst of the present. Every morning before I read the market reports or review my foundation's strategies, I take a moment to reflect on my father's method. It takes only a minute, but that minute shapes everything that follows. The method reminds me that I am not just managing capital, I am testing a hypothesis about how the world works. I am not just solving a problem, I am engaging with systems that go far beyond my own interests. I am not just making decisions, I am following a process of inquiry that sees more than my own biases ever could. This doesn't make me passive or less strategic. If anything, it makes me more decisive. I am not paralyzed by the need to calculate every possible outcome, because my framework is built on the idea of fallibility. I can commit fully to a position knowing that I have also defined the conditions under which I will abandon it. Course corrections are part of the plan itself. People sometimes ask how I can take such large risks in the face of uncertainty. The answer is in that method. When you believe that reality will always provide feedback, even failures become valuable data rather than disasters. Even a losing trade becomes a lesson in the market's true structure, a structure you couldn't have understood otherwise. I think about my father often. He died long before the Quantum Fund or the Open Society Foundations came to define my life. But in a very real sense, he made all of it possible, not because he gave me capital or connections, but because he taught me how to think. He taught me how to listen for the flaw in the consensus. He taught me how to subordinate my will to the facts on the ground. He taught me how to trust a process of discovery, even when I couldn't see the destination. That simple three-step method contains everything I've learned about markets, risk, and affecting change. It is the foundation beneath every foundation, the strategy behind every strategy. First, understand the prevailing belief. Then, find the internal contradiction. Finally, have the courage to act on your discovery. You do not have to believe in my specific theories to benefit from this wisdom. You do not need to use these exact words to access the principles they contain. But I would encourage you to consider the possibility that there is a more accurate view available to you that goes beyond your own analysis, your own experience, your own ideology. That there might be a perspective larger than your current viewpoint, a reality more complex than your current strategy. The world tells you to trust your gut, to follow your passion, to believe in yourself. But sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to rigorously question your own assumptions, to ask to be shown a reality that is truer than the one you would choose for yourself. Sometimes the most sophisticated strategy is the simplest intellectual method. Sometimes the voice of a survivor contains more wisdom than all the experts and PhDs combined. If you had a mentor like my father, remember what they taught you. If you didn't, consider borrowing his method until you find your own. If this kind of critical inquiry feels foreign to you, think of it as a commitment to radical open-mindedness. Look at the challenges you're facing, the decisions that keep you awake at night. Maybe what you need isn't more information or more options. Maybe what you need is the courage to question the prevailing belief and the wisdom to trust the feedback you receive. Maybe what you need is a method that connects you to reality, not just to your own understanding. I carry my father with me every day in those principles. His clarity, his pragmatism, his certainty that reality is the ultimate arbiter, available to those humble enough to look for it. That method has guided me through market crashes and political upheavals, through moments of doubt and seasons of conviction. It can guide you too. Remember, the most important lessons often come from the most fundamental sources. Sometimes a father's survival guide contains everything you need to navigate the world. The truth is there. The question is whether you're humble enough to look for it and brave enough to act on what you find.